What's good, everybody? I'm the G with a PhD, and you're tuned in to the Green Gorilla channel, the place where black men can express themselves freely. Straight up, no chaser. Right about this time, I want to give a shout out to all the members of my channel. I want to give a shout out to Nicola Zlobin, Kalan Jakala, Leroy Honeycutt, Sherrod Martin, Ricky Dawson, Brother Love, Black Dog, NEU, Cedric Bowman, True 7360, BK Born Shaheed, James Washington, Hostile Adept, Seven Coast Dojo, Ronan Martin, Shop Talk Live, WPR1, Roguish the Billmonger, I Care, The Nameless Protagonist, Force Windu, Lady Miss Thing Green, BGS, Ibmore, and Marvin Battle Jr. Thank you so very much for your memberships. And you too, in listening land, can also become a member of the Green Gorilla channel. All you got to do is hit the join button next to the subscribe button and find out the various programs that I have or the memberships I have for the channel. And please donate if you can, because every little donation and every membership helps. So having said that, I want to give a shout out to everybody out there in the chat. Louis Kanye, Ebo Sosa, DC, Unfadable, Louis Kanye, D-Rock Den. And look, the Unfadable, Raphael Brown, and BGS, I see you up in this joint. Now, you know, I hope Dr. Neal can join us too. I don't know what's going on with his schedule, but I did send him a link. So if he can come in, he'll join us if he can. But I do have a guest here today. I have a brother of mine that I always chop it up with, and he goes by the name of Sanddog. Sanddog, what's good with you, brother?
Real dog, nothing much, man. Just another fall day here on this side of Earth.
Yeah, and what side of the earth are you on for the people who don't know?
I'm in the Middle East, man. United Arab Emirates, but you know, a lot of times, team, you could find me anywhere between India or South Africa, depending on when I have to travel.
Oh man, so what is it like, man, to go to various parts of the world and to get outside of the context of the United States culture, man? What is that actually like, brother?
What you know what it is, team? You kind of see a mix of things, right? You get to see, you get to see the things that you're blessed with in the United States, and then you also get to see the things that you don't have, right? So you get to see the pluses and minuses of everything. And at the end of the day, a lot in life is about what you're looking for. So for me, I have like a pioneering, expeditionary type spirit. I enjoy taking risks. So for me, for the majority of my adult life, with the exception of the UAE, I live in third world countries.
Wow. So would you say that, what are the pros and the cons of living in these third world countries? Because a lot of times people would consider third world country living to be beneath them. It's like taking a big step backwards.
Yeah, correct. The pros is, again, like you remember when you and I talked, right? One of the things is that, you don't necessarily, say, because on this side of the world too, nationality also plays in how you're treated. So what happens is that you kind of escape the layer of race. So in the places that I go, I become more of the American than I am, let's say the black man, right? And so at that point, then people will engage you in certain societies. People will engage you, based upon the status of your nationality. So there'll be people that they'll treat better because they're from a particular place, and then people that they may treat not so well.
Wow. So given your American citizenship, you all often find that people respect you more?
Yeah, well, yeah. So people respect you because one of the things that you have to take into account is when we talk about like media or propaganda. So because of television and the mass media that we have, most people are familiar with America, right? So let's say, for example, if somebody is from Chittagong in Bangladesh, right? So unless you're just someone who enjoys history or geography or that kind of thing, you're not going to know much about someone from Bangladesh in terms of their history or how the nation used to be East Pakistan, etc. Right? So you won't know that much. But America is in everybody's America's on everybody's TV screen. So even here in the UAE, man, I'm having arguments about, you know, LeBron being better than Jordan. So you guys didn't see it because you were in the States. So like when Colin Kaepernick took the knee, over here you saw Emirati kids or kids in the UAE buying Colin Kaepernick jerseys over here.
Wow. So he's like a hero. Yeah, like a hero of sorts.
Yeah. So you know, so you had cats over here buying Kaepernick jerseys. As a matter of fact, one of my homeboys from Saudi, because they played 12 years a slave here, right? And when the kids walked out of that movie, they were talking to each other in Arabic, and they were like, "Did that really happen? Is that their minds are just blown in terms of, you know, from what they see from America on a regular standpoint, and the fact that level of evil happened there, right? And, you know, and so for them, it was insane that you could literally beat the humanity out of a human being.
Wow, that's wild, man. I want to give a shout out to my brother, Sharad Martin. Thanks for the donation, brother. And if you can, please support the channel for the people out there listening. So, you know, the subject matter that we were going to talk about today, and you know, that you decided that you wanted to bring up is, you know, the idea of what can the book of Proverbs teach us as Black men as we walk through this, you know, this perilous journey that we have in the United States or elsewhere throughout the entirety of the world. So, like, what kind of made you think of this whole thing, this whole topic of discussion, and why do you find it relevant for people today? How can a message that was written for men thousands of years ago have any impact on our lives today?
You know, yeah, because, you know, at the end of the day, team, right, it's called wisdom. And one of the things that I, just from my perspective, right, I don't think that it benefits. There's only a rare handful of us, right, that could balance existentialism and nihilism simultaneously. Right? That's a rare handful. That's a rare handful of people, right? That could kind of, you know, I guess as BGS would call it, like the black pill, like that could, you know, that can see it, you know, that could see life at that state and still function. And so for the rest of us, right, there has to be a foundation or a guideline. It was a conversation that I had with a friend, and we were talking about education. And we were saying in education, no one ever tells you how to beat the devil, right? How to avoid the pitfalls in life. And so for us as African-American men, right, a lot of us, you know, through generations get caught up in the pitfalls of life, whether it's women, drugs, you know, money, you know, et cetera. And so the idea is to have the discussion because, you know, I thought about it when I was listening to Walt Diddy. And when Walt Diddy was talking about how there are several generations, you know, of those of us that are within this particular sphere. And so, again, you got, you know, BGS and those guys who are boomers, you know, us are Xers. And then now you have millennials and Gen Zs that are kind of coming into the fold. And I think that before you get into the more advanced stuff, then you could kind of start at the basics, well, which is philosophy, which you will find in philosophy or religion, right? And so the whole idea is to, maybe God willing, help to develop propaganda and a culture that values wisdom, right? Because the wisdom is how you could avoid the foolishness. There's a passage in the Bible, you know, because I'm Muslim, and so I'll kind of share both, but I grew up Christian for 34 years. So in my family, if there's 7 days in a week, I was in church for 10 of them, right? and there's a statement in the Bible that says, you know, when I was a child, I spoke as a child and behaved as a child. And when I was a man, I put away childish things. And so the idea of it is that, you know, for us is that, you know, again, whether you're young, you know what I'm saying, or whether you're older, you can always benefit from wisdom. So when I get guys like you, Dr. Hassan, or BGS, right? You guys are at a vantage point in life that I'm not on, right? So you guys may be at a higher cliff on the mountain, Whereas, okay, I can see so much of the horizon, but, I don't have 60 years of life and children and relationships and all of these different things, right? And so that has a different vantage point. And so for me, I was able to avoid a lot of drama in life, learning from the mistakes of others than actually getting into it myself. As Ron Wills would say, the power of observation. And so this is something that I wanted to share, amongst us in the sphere, as Black men, the power of observation, as opposed to, running through the minefield and getting blown up yourself.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that Black men are doomed to have to endure is we have to learn by experience, whereas we don't get the opportunity to learn through direction and through observation, as you said. Because even if we are able to observe, what is it that we're actually observing other than debauchery and dysfunction and, social immobility as opposed to, uprightness and upward mobility. So I want to give a shout out to Ebo Sosa. Thank you so much for the contribution. Masculinity in Movies, Walt Diddy. Thank you, sir. And T Fitness for you. I also want to give you a shout out. Thank you so much for the contribution, brother. But what about those naysayers, though, Sandog? Those individuals who think that religion in and of itself is an opiate, a kind of form of social control in order to make you meek and to not take on the warrior spirit, a way of conditioning and training the mind such that the mind will not become revolutionary, such that men will become sheepish instead of like lions and, to stand with integrity and to stand with authority and audaciousness. So what would you say to people who, kind of dispel the notion that there's any value to be found within the context of a religious tradition?
Okay, well, what you need to understand, right, is at the end of the day, knowledge is power. So remember, things like books and reading and high literacy rates, if you actually study history, a lot of these things, as you know, are relatively new, right? If you go back 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, books are harder to get. To be literate is something that's harder to get. And so you have to separate people who used religion in terms of for their own power or benefit versus what it can do for yourself, right? So when you look at the old papacy in the church or what may have happened in certain countries in the Middle East, all of these things were done in order to facilitate control, within governments or to have power in a certain hand of people. However, if you go into the book, right? So if you go into the books, within the Abrahamic traditions, especially for Christianity and Islam. So for us as Muslims, we recognize that there are 4 holy books. One is the Torah, which is your Old Testament. Then there's the Zabeel, which are the Sons of David. It's the Injil, which is the gospel book by Jesus. And then there's the Quran itself. Now, with that being said, when you go into the Injil and into the Quran, what does it tell you? It says, well, the Bible says, study and show thyself approved, right? And then the first commandment of Islam is Iqra, read in the name of your Lord. And what I would tell a lot of people is when you study these traditions, right? When you stand in front of God on the day of judgment, it will be you and your Lord alone. You will be naked in front of the Lord alone. So there's no one else you can blame, right? Because at the end of the day, this is up to you. So there are hadiths from the Prophet Muhammad that says that when people are being pushed into hell, right? So at the end of days, right? The devil will stand up in front of the people and say, "Hey, listen, I had no power over you. I merely suggested it, right? He said, I'm going to my fate and there's nothing you could do for me, and vice versa." And as people are being pushed into hell, let's say, for example, if I was a mass murderer and a Klansman. So if you're the one that put me onto that lifestyle, as you're being pushed into hell, I'm going to tell the angels double his punishment because he's the reason why I'm here. So at the end of the day, it is up to you. and the instructions are clear, right? It is up to you to make sure that you have enough oil to light your lamp.
True indeed. True indeed. Look, I personally, I have no problem with religion as a means by which to provide instruction on virtue. And again, most of the world was not literate, couldn't read, couldn't write, and so the only way that they could absorb messages was through imagery and through lectures and quite literally masses or through proselytization. That was the only way that they could learn, because that was the only way that they could absorb messages. So I believe that human beings are storytellers, and for the most part they learn more through imagery and through stories than they do through terse and abstract and logical arguments. But that's just my belief. And because the stories are powerful and they resonate with you for a longer period of time than does some sort of abstract argument, right?
Yeah.
So that's my viewpoint on that. But having said all that, where would you start with wisdom?
Well,
where would you start?
Well, where I would start is, again, because a lot of us remember, in the last conversation and I, where you had the chart, so you could, like I said, it's so many areas in life where it's applied, right? But in Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, we're taught in various hadiths and also in the Bible, one of the first things, because, I didn't bring up the verses for that, but I wanted to mention it. So one of the first things in terms of beating the devil, right, which I'll just simplify as the pitfalls of life. When you look at black men in your youth, but especially as you get older, one of the first things that's quintessential to your success is the company you keep and the type of people you decide to be around.
For sure.
Right?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And so for us in Islam, there are various hadiths, and that I didn't bring up the Bible verses as well that relate into the power of keeping yourself in good company. You know what I'm saying? Either be it, either be a man or woman. So these are one of the things that's on the path of success, whereas you don't have people with that devilish spirit who are looking to lead you astray, to get you to get turned out into gangs or drugs or a promiscuous lifestyle, right? But the verses that I picked, which will resonate, I believe will resonate with many, is that you start with one of the reasons why I became Muslim is because I had a dispute with the Apostle Paul. And the Apostle Paul said something in the book of Corinthians, right? I think it's Corinthians 1, chapter 7. And the Apostle Paul said that it is better for a man not to marry, right? So that way he could focus more on the affairs of the Lord, right? But if he cannot, and it's funny because, especially for those who are in the MGTOW community, right? And it says, but if he cannot manage his desires, it is better for him to be married rather than submit to his desires and burn in hell. And so what happens is that when you look at what the Apostle Paul is saying, is that, he's not dismissing marriage in its entirety. What the Apostle Paul is saying is that for some men, right, your calling or your legacy may be bigger than wives and children.
Right.
Right. And so some men have a particular calling where if you were to have a wife, it would be extraordinarily difficult. So if somebody were to lead the life of Jesus, right, to lead that life, to stand up and fight for these righteous causes, right? So so people that are in the positions, I guess, Jesus, I can't recall if Fred Hampton was married or whatever the case might be. And so what happens is that in that discussion, you're talking about the different talents of men. And for many men or for certain men, their calling, again, it's not dismissing marriage or saying that it shouldn't be done, because, again, God says it's good for men not to be alone. But for certain men, as I read and I understood the verses, that for certain men, that, you may have a particular calling on your life as to where as to where, that might not be suitable for you. So even now, I have a younger adopted Pakistani brother who, when I talk to him, like, he wants to be a filmmaker. He's in his mid-20s, and and in his culture, they're talking marriage and everything else. And I'm like, you want to be a filmmaker. And I said, before you get married, now is the time to take the risk. Now is the time to sleep in the car. Now is the time to, sit up all days and night making the film and everything else. Because if you were to get a wife, and especially if that woman doesn't understand your mission, it may derail your plans.
Yeah, this is what a lot of men don't understand, and about relationships, and about the energy and the effort that a relationship requires. Because whereas men are goal oriented, and I'm not going to say even most men, but I mean most successful men are goal oriented, and they have objectives and missions to accomplish, whereas women are more emotive, and they deal with relations with others more so than they do with goal orientation. And so they're going to distract you because they're going to require energy and attention, whereas your energy and attention, if you have a goal or a mission, is going to take away from it. I mean, it's just by the nature of a relationship in general, right? So I think you're right about that. But where else would you go after that? Because I got some places I would like to go myself, but like I said, again, it's like I said, it's all freestyle. And then here, right, you hear a lot of guys, and for many of us, right, one of the main things that brought us here was kind of like our ups and downs in life with women and everything else, right? And if you, like I said, again, if you were to hold on to wisdom, because for a lot of us, right, in life, you have what's called cheap lessons and you have expensive lessons. So for me, I have my cheap lessons, but then there were certain things that I had to go through in order to get the understanding on it, right? And so for me, in terms of for a lot of men that are out there, right, you have to look at, or there needs to be a baseline. So for example, for many of us as men, let's say when it comes to mate selection, right, there's no baseline. And I heard BGS say it 1,000 times before. You'll ask a guy, if you ask a woman, what does she want out of a man? She has a clear list, right? But if you ask the guy, again, for the most part, she just needs to be pretty and ready to service him. And that's really not enough if you're going to marriage these long-term relationships / business units that we call family, right? You would need a deeper understanding. And so what happens is that at that point, you have the word of God. Many of us tie marriage into religion. And so at that point, you have the word of God, in your faith that will give you what the baseline and what the criterion should be, to have a spouse. Right. And so, when you go into Ephesians 5, verses 21 through 33, right. So I won't read it all, but like how a lot of people talk about in terms of submission. Right. And what people don't see is that sad and most unfortunately, a lot of people see this as a one-way thing. And that's not the case. It says submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is head of the church, his body, and is himself its savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Right? So now what you see is that you see this kind of symbiotic relationship, right? So what's supposed to happen is at the end of the day, the man is supposed to submit to the will of God, right? So right. The man is not out there just willy-nilly twisting and turning and doing as he will. And I think that what happens is that for a lot of us, or maybe even for some women within our group, they have a very childlike approach when it comes to concepts of freedom and submission, right? So when I was a boy, I used to trip that I had to go to bed after Night Rider, but my dad was up until 11 o'clock at night,
right? Not understanding that my father was undergoing this process, not understanding that my father was looking at, okay, how am I going to pay the rent? Right? Christmas is coming. I need to buy gifts, right? My mom was a stay-at-home mom. My wife wants to get her hair done, right? We need to fix the car and all of this stuff. So my dad was, so I'm looking at it from the standpoint of that my dad, it was free to do what he wanted to do simply because he was older and he was dad, and I had to live by all the rules. And I think that within our community, like I said, you may have women or other groups of people who don't have the real understanding of what husbandry is and what it involves. And like I said, even to the point where, like I said, you're talking about where Christ, where Christ was willing to give his life for the church, so does the man do for his family. In Islam, we say that when a man gets married, he completes half of his religion. And the reason why you complete half of your religion is simply because you have now done your part to uphold society, right? So the protection, and the Quran also says that men are the maintainers of women and children, right? And we all know that when men are around, when men are involved in the community, there's typically a level of peace and prosperity, and defense from all forms of chaos. So when you simply by marrying a woman, like I told you guys before in my previous discussions, simply by marrying a woman, housing her, feeding her, clothing her, looking after the children, making sure the lights are on and that they're educated, that in and of itself is protection, right? Protection is not you squeezing your can of spinach and going out there and coming to blows with the streets and wildlife.
Correct.
Right? So, because and this is what I'm trying to tell guys. So when you look at the word of God, and we'll even get into it. So, we'll even get into it, and I'm getting ahead of future points that I want to make. But, since it came to mind now, see, a lot of guys, if you understand security and protection is preventive, which means that you take measures in advance. So if William works in the warehouse, right, there's a sign, right? No horseplay in the warehouse, right? Hey, there's the sign on the tape, wet floor, right? And so if I decide to disregard these warnings, right, I go from protection to mercy. And God is merciful, but what you don't want is that you don't want to be put at the mercy of a circumstance, right? So it's better for you to heed a warning and stay in protection, because if you decide to work out of protection, you are now in the realm of mercy, and mercy is like a plate that's thrown up in the air, right? When it falls, you don't know how it's going to break. It could break clean in half, or it could break in a dozen pieces, right? And so this is why, from my perspective, that, for us within the sphere, for a lot of us, that religion, like I said, religion is an excellent foundation to start with or to maintain. And then for those who are curious, who seek to go further, like for me, one of my favorite books, BGS is in the chat. One of my favorite books is Manly P. Hall and the Secret Teachings of All Ages, right? And there was a guy that BGS would talk to called Lightbearer. And I never looked for that guy's channel. And this is a caveat. I never looked for that guy's channel because it scared me. Because for me, before I came to Islam, and I know it's a caveat and I'll come back, I studied everything: Hinduism, Taoism, all of that stuff. And if BGS is listening, the one thing that stopped me is that in my curiosity, one day I found a book, and the book was thick, and the book was titled Satanism, Witchcraft, and Magic. And I stared at I promise you, I stared at that book for 3 months. And I knew that if I opened that book, there stood a chance that I could get more than what I bargained for. And I never, to this day, that I lost in the storage. That book is long gone. But like I said, I never opened it. And when BGS would have certain conversations with Lightbearer, I would actually switch it off And then if I caught the live, I would actually switch it off, wait for the discussion to be finished, then come back and listen to it and stay on, depending on what they were talking about, right? Because, like I said, for a lot of us, right? So for a lot of us, there's certain levels of knowledge or information that we can manage. And this level of knowledge and this level of information, it's good for us to manage.
True indeed. True indeed. You know, I want to give a shout out to an individual who hit me up on the Cash App by the name of, if I can find him, Marvin Sims. Thank you so much for the Cash App donation. You know, but I just want to get more simplistic, man, and just start off, you know, with, you know, Proverbs 1:5. Let the wise hear and increase learning, or increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. You know, that's Proverbs 1:5. And I think the message that I draw from that is, you know, you can never get enough wisdom and you can never be too wise. You know, you can get too drunk, you can get too full, you know, but you can never get too wise. And that's one of the things that, you know, I think people need to be aware of, that you can never stop learning. Some of us think that, you know, we know so much, but we think that we have nothing left to learn because we think we know it all. So that's the one thing, you know, that resonates with me. And that's just how the book begins, the book of Proverbs, right? That if you're a wise man, you never stop learning. You know that you're a limited being, a finite being, and you can't know it all. So that's one of the things I like to start with. You know what I'm saying? Like, understand your place and position in the universe, and that you could always gain more and more wisdom. You know?
Correct. Because you know what, team? You are always in need of guidance, right? Always. So, like I said, because wherever you are in life, there's always there will be somebody who's on a higher point of that mountain, right? So for me, I'm not a father, but there are men who are fathers. So God willing, if I was able to become one, right, then there are men who are higher on that mountain, right, who can point me in the right direction, you know what I'm saying, as opposed to me just simply staring at the horizon.
True indeed.
Right? You know what I'm saying? And so, like I said, so I think that so for us as men, what you want to do is that you want to avoid arrogance, right? Because this is what you're talking about. When somebody feels that they know it all and there's not much more that they can learn, like I said, these things are, like I said, this is where you fall into the level of arrogance. And the crazy part about knowledge, because people talk about knowledge being power. And I think that statement is paradoxical, because the funny part about knowledge is the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know shit.
Precisely. Yeah. I mean, so, you know, that's, you're a finite being. And, you know, there's another phrase saying you could be a jack of all trades, but a master of none. I mean, well, you could be a master of one trade, but you could be a jack of all trades, right? You can't, you know, you could be a jack of all trades and a master of none. So that's what I meant to get out, but it kind of came out a little bit jumbled. But there's always room to know things. And again, the humility, you know, that's part of our fraternal, you know, obligation, man, and you know, part of our principles. Humility with dignity, man. You know, and to understand that you got something that you can learn from everybody, you know? And that's why I try to keep it humble, man. I try to keep it yeoman, man. I don't get into all of these rhetorical flourishes, man. And, you know, every now and then I will remind people of my educational attainment, but at the end of the day, I'm just a person trying to figure it out like everybody else. You understand what I'm saying? And it's also important, you know, that you got to seek wisdom. You know, like, you know, if you call out for insight and raise your voice for understanding, if you seek it like silver and search for it as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. That's Proverbs 2, verse 4-5. But the point is, you got to look for it too, though. You know, and when you find it, you got to be humble. You know what I'm saying? So knowledge is not just going to come to you. Wisdom is not just going to come to you. You got to go in search of it. And when you find it, you got to be humble, you know, and you got to also, again, going back to the first point, you got to understand that you never stop learning. And that's that humility piece, though, because some people, again, they'll feel like they got it all figured out, and they don't even want to listen to anybody else. They know it all. So what's the use of listening if you already know it all? Then you become intolerant. Then that's when you let down, that when you not necessarily let it down, but that's when you put your guard up. But then that the hardness of your guard makes it fragile. You know what I'm saying? Like, just going back to something historical, right? Like, Napoleon was a great general precisely because he was able to understand that he wasn't in the position to understand what the hell was going on the ground, right? So he needed intel from his sergeants and from his infantry in order to gain insight. So it wasn't just a top-down organizational structure. He was like, I'm going to learn what's going on from the grunts on the ground and use that intel in order to be able to actually have the impact in the war. But some people, man, like to fight these cerebral battles, and they never like to try to figure out what's going on the ground. So that's just something, that I thought I would add, man. But go ahead, my brother.
No, team. Like I said, I'm with you completely. And and so what happens is, because for me, I talk to people, and when you talk about like the power of God's word, right? So when you talk about like even the United States being built on Judeo-Christian values, right? When Martin Luther King was fighting for civil rights, he said, look, if I was in China, I wouldn't be up here doing this, but somewhere I read, right? If America was committed to totalitarianism, I wouldn't be up here doing this, but somewhere I read. And so what happens is, when you look at the founding fathers of the United States of America, these men had their level of wickedness. They did what they did, but for whatever reasons also, they were also conscious about the words of God. And one of the things about the United States, I think that what has preserved it up until this point is that those words of eternal justice from God are written into many documents. So it doesn't matter how big of a racist that whoever, like Hamilton or whoever these guys are that passed away a long time ago, right? One of the things that they could not do is that they could not undermine the word of God, right? As the Bible says, heaven and earth shall pass away, but the word of God shall stand forevermore. So whether they intended it or it was an unintended consequence, the wisdom of God would then come on to function as a platform for the freedom of slaves, for the rights of women, and just human rights in general, within the United States. And so, like I said, like for a lot of us, we can't look at this stuff and we can't, like I said, we can't undermine it. Like I said, you have a handful of guys who have years of knowledge or study, who can do all of these things. But what I will tell anybody is that when you go to war, and what I told my soldiers when we went to war, I said, I'm going to tell you what my father told me. A hero ain't nothing but a damn sandwich, right? What's going to keep you alive is the basics, right? So know your ABCs, your 1, 2, 3s, right? Dot your I's and cross your T's. And that's what I told my soldiers, that, again, what makes you a hero is someone that can stick to the basics in extraordinary circumstances. Right? And so I remember in the old Wu-Tang Clan song, they called the Bible the basic instructions before leaving Earth. Right? And so, when you have these basic instructions for the foundational instructions, again, it's kind of like a training. And so what happens is, as you're engaging life, the training kicks in. Right, and then you're able to recognize certain things, right? So when Proverbs goes in and it tells you about the adulterous woman, right, and how that leads to death and how that leads to destruction, right? So when I was a young man in college, right, I had a woman invite me to her home. She was gorgeous, gorgeous, right? Again, had 2 basketballs in her pants. Right, but at the end of the day, I declined her. Right, I ended up declining her because what happened for that woman was that she had a man that she was living with. Right, and allegedly that guy was locked up. right? But had I been dumb enough to go over there, who knows? That could have been the day that guy walked him home from wherever he got locked up at, and then where would I be?
Precisely. I got another guest, man, saying, dog, that comes to join us on the show today. His name is Dr. Ronald Neal. He has a theology degree. Brother Ronald Neal, what's good with you, man?
Hey, what's good? How you guys doing this afternoon?
Doing good, man.
Doing good, man. What's up, Doc?
Good. Hey, how you doing, man? I see the bat signal went up, and I had to respond to it. I'm just getting into the conversation. I was in the middle of multitasking, but I'm happy to be a part of the discussion.
Yeah, so we're talking about wisdom and what the book of Proverbs can teach black men.
Okay.
You got some feedback going on, Doc. Maybe you got YouTube going at the same time.
Hold on. Yeah, let me close this. Hello. I mean, is that better?
Yes, sir.
Okay, got you.
I still hear a little bit of feedback, but it's not nearly as loud as it was. So
okay.
But for the most part, we're talking about the wisdom tradition,
the
Judeo-Christian point of view, and how that can be used by men, black men in particular, to navigate some of the perils that they may be exposed to in this contemporary, hedonistic and secularized culture that we live in.
Yeah.
I mean, because it seems to me like virtue has been turned on its head and made to appear as vice itself, whereas vice is invited as being virtuous. So to be able to discern what is and what's not virtuous and what is vicious seems to be, very problematic for people nowadays in this culture. And so we're just trying to have a discussion about how to, again, navigate through the, the Scylla on one side and the Charybdis on the other, because they, these monsters are waiting to eat us up, bro.
I understand. Oh yeah, absolutely.
The devil desires to sift you like wheat.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. No, I'm happy that you're having this discussion, man. Because I mean, you are correct. I mean, at this moment, I mean, we are living in a society that is rootless. It's ruthless, but it's also rootless. And what I mean by rootless is that there is a serious aversion to the past and what came before us, tradition, which includes religion, and we have been deluded into thinking that the present, the moment, is all that there is, and with the conversations that we've been having in this space about black men and their relationship to women and other things and black male issues. I mean, all of that involves where we are at this moment, in society in terms of black men's prospects, and what we have to recognize that secularism has alienated a lot of us from the riches of the past. So, what I want to do is to kind of recommend that black men to kind of get a sense of things, to understand that this world has not always been this way, and they're looking at religious traditions, whether you're talking about the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, or looking at Hinduism, Buddhism, looking at African traditional religions or other indigenous expressions of religions. I think that is fundamental for black men to get greater bearing in terms of what masculinity has been in the past, what purpose has meant, what virtue has meant. So you're talking about virtue, you're talking about morality. I mean, we're talking about sensibilities that have existed for thousands and thousands of years, and we do a disservice to ourselves by thinking that the popular fashions of today, the hedonism, the presentism, somehow or another makes us more advanced, more enlightened, more sophisticated, more innovative than those who came before us. I often tell my students, I say, I mean, you're only, if you have your understanding of the world begins with the year that you were born. The year 2000, the year 2001. You are a culturally impoverished human being. And so I think it's a good thing that we're having this conversation, and there's a lot to glean from the world traditions.
Yeah, and it's funny though, because as you said, this world impresses upon you that like what is happening now is the most important thing that has ever happened before. So the presentism, as you call it, it deracinates you, it deroots you, it tears you away from everything that made sense for millennia, and now we have to adopt these new principles that, quite frankly, they're unnatural, they're counterintuitive. They have no basis, I would argue, in wisdom. I think it has a basis in ideals and ideology, which are not tried and true. And I think that our attachment to presentism is going to kill us, and you see it killing us.
Yeah.
But there are still brothers, man, who resist. I mean, they get caught into the hedonism, they get caught into the life of an epicure. It's all about having fun. It's all about thinking with the man behind, well, not behind, but below the belt.
Yeah.
And Sandog just spoke to this temptation, man. How the temptation of sex, the temptation of getting drunk or high, the temptation of just eating away without exercising, just all of these things presented themselves to us, and because there's no tradition to check it, everything is just okay. Whatever you feel like in your individual personhood is okay for you to do, you just do it. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I would say, you have, tradition. So this week, I was going over the Buddhist tradition. You have the story of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, and he was a noble, he was an aristocrat, and the story that's told around his life is, he grew up in the life of opulence. His father, wanted him to follow in his own footsteps. This was a person who didn't have anything, withheld from him. But he was a precocious person, and he wanted to find out more about, the human experience. And he came to the realization, it just long story short, that pleasure, that hedonism, in and of itself, does not satisfy. It does not satisfy, human longings. And there's the story of the search and going upon his path of what we call enlightenment. And discovering the Bodhi tree, and having this seeking experience where he goes from this life of opulence to a life of renunciation, where you go the direct opposite of hedonism, where you abstain from the pleasures of the world in an effort to kind of get centered and grounded or what have you. But it's out of that experience that one becomes awakened. One understands the self in a much more expansive way. And so I think that our society, and even men and women, we have neglected those ancient narratives, teachings from the world traditions that help us to become centered, that help us not get caught up in the destructive nature of the kind of hedonism that we're seeing right now. And even even beyond the Buddhist tradition. I mean, it's in the Christian tradition as well. You have the story of the prodigal son. The story of the young man who gets his inheritance from his father. He wants to leave home. It was a good thing that he did that. And in the story, as it's told in the New Testament, you have this young man who takes his inheritance and he goes out and he goes to the club and he gets lit and crunk and everything, and he wastes his money on on all sorts of pleasure, and he's broke and he's destitute, and eventually he finds himself, going back home to his father, and the story ends with the father receiving the young man. So I mean, we have traditions that help us think about the self, that help us think about our place in the world, man. And Black men need to really to take seriously what has come before them, man. Because yes, we are bombarded, man. We are bombarded with immediate gratification. We are bombarded with fantastical entertainment and demands, from the society that we live in, from women, from our families, and the like. And you need grounding, you need centering. And I'm going to be honest with you, man. Everyone. Now, I'm not going to say everyone, but it is not unusual for people to go through a moment. I know you had your your broadcast the other night on the whole phase. I know. I mean, some people, they have a window, where they might stray from the kind of moral traditions that have grounded people just for a moment, and then they return to them. Not everybody returns to them, but sometimes a lot of times that does happen. But it's that original grounding that's significant, that's important.
Right. So, I mean, what you got to say about that, brother?
Well, I mean, dog, as it said, right, there's a way that seemeth right into a man, but the end thereof is death, right? Because, again, what I would tell a lot of people, like, especially in religion, right, you have to look at backwards planning. So, meaning that a lot of people, because in this hedonistic world, right, discipline. So things like religion calls for discipline, and it also calls through concentration through prayer. Right. And so in this world of immediate gratification, this is a superpower that religion could give you, because in today's world, to have discipline and concentration will make you more powerful than most men. Right. Because, you're living in a time where people can only absorb information like maybe 5, 10, 20 seconds, one minute at a time. And it goes back to what the doctor was saying in terms of something that gives you grounding and something that gives you perspective. Because if you're looking at the world today, you're only seeing it within the terms of the world today. And one of the things that I've seen that Black men did in some circles, because it goes back to what you were talking about, a slave morality versus, the slave morality versus the morality of the free. And so when Jesus came in the Christian tradition, he says, I have come to set the captives free. And the last thing that Jesus was anything but weak. Right. And so when Jesus went into the temple, and he's debating the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and he walks into the temple and there are doves in our days and terms, right? You got people in there with ATM machines, right? People in there with weak offerings and doing all manners of nonsense and commerce or exchange. And Jesus went in there, kicked the table over, right? Tied the cord into a whip, turned the table over, and said that my house shall be a house of prayer. So when you look at the men, so what I would encourage Black men to do is that when you look at these men in the Bible, these men weren't these kind of tender, mild, and meek creatures that a lot of popular media that you've been given will make you think that they were. These guys were tough, right? They were anything. Like I said, they were anything but weak. And a lot of them, God willing, when we all get to heaven, you're going to meet a lot of people who used to be something else but saved.
True indeed.
Right?
True indeed.
So you're going to meet a lot of ex so-and-so. So for me, if I am an ex-convict, right, there's something in there for me, right? So again, when you look at Jonas and being in the belly of the whale, and being in the belly of the whale is a part of the hero's journey. There's something that you're supposed to get out of being in the wilderness or in the belly of the whale. right? You know, if I used to be a thief, right, on a cross, Lord, remember me when you enter your kingdom. So you're going to see, so for Black men, the whole idea is that in this, there are messages of hope, because there's a lot of stuff out there telling you what you can and cannot be. And so what happens is that we have to start looking at this through a different lens, right? We are no longer slaves. And so, you know, let's get away from reading these stories, these historical documents with the mindset of slaves, because there's a lot in it that's designed for you to be free. God said, I want you to have life, and I want you to have it more abundantly. And so let's take the steps to do that.
You know, so right now we got a brother in the chat, right? And he's he's hostile towards religion. And look, I get it, and I understand why one would be hostile to religious doctrine, especially when it becomes dogmatic and it becomes recalcitrant to the point where you can't deviate from it without being punished, and when it teaches you to be submissive and to not be heroic, as Brother Sandog just pointed out, because there will be tests and there will be situations in which people who profess a doctrine from a particular religious perspective will have you do with that which is not really virtuous, but it appears to be virtuous, right? So here, and again, this brother may have just come into the conversation, but it must be known and it must be pointed out that throughout most of the entirety of human existence, most people haven't been able to read, right? They haven't been able to write. So the only way that they can receive understanding about morality and virtue in any way whatsoever, it would have to be through songs, through stories, through allegories. Just in the same way that you got fairy tales right now that impart moral lessons, human beings understood that in order to understand certain moral lessons, that it was quite convenient and quite effective to put them in the context of a story so that you can glean or learn something from it, right? So there are some people who look at religion literally. To them, it's nothing but something literal, and it speaks to the supernatural, as opposed to something that is allegorical and it can teach you a lesson about your life now and about how you are in a certain context, emblematic, representative of the deity itself. So, Brother Neal, you are a theologian. Yeah. Teach us about those who would take the Marxian approach to religion and deem it or regard it as nothing but oppressive and nothing but restrictive and nothing but a maker of conciliatory lemmings who just follow the dictates of those who stand above them in relation to ecclesiastical authority. What say you about this?
Well, I would say, yes, there are real merits too. You're talking about the critique of religion or critics of religion. You have, atheist critics, other sorts of critics, and those critiques are legitimate and they're very real. I mean, there's a history of, violence, a history of enslavement, history of conquest that's associated with religious traditions, most traditions on the planet, with the exception of the indigenous traditions, So it's a legitimate critique. However, we also know that the so-called secular or even atheist societies, socialist societies have also been oppressive. They have their underside as well. There's a underside of communism, and the kind of totalitarianism that can occur when you take a secular ideology and turn it into an absolute, and impose it on entire cultures and populations. But I think that one has to have a balanced approach, and that's the way I teach religion. I teach religion in a way where it's understood that religion is a double-edged sword. Okay, so to the degree that religion has done heinous things in the world, it has also done a lot of good in the world. And so when we talk about we talk about hospitals, we talk about educational institutions, when we talk about our systems of benevolence and philanthropy, when we talk about literacy, literacy. Particularly in the West, as we know it, was facilitated, by the Protestant Reformation, and so religion has done good in the world, and so it's important to have kind of a balanced outlook and perspective, on it, and at the same time, as you indicated earlier, human beings. Here's the thing: human beings are shaped by narrative. We're shaped by narrative, and religion. If there's one thing that connects all of the traditions, again, whether you're talking about the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or you're talking about Hinduism, Buddhism, the African traditions, or you're talking about Native American traditions, those indigenous traditions where they don't have written scriptures and what have you. Those traditions are shaped by narrative, by story. You're right, by imagery. I start my intro to religion courses often with a writer by the name of Karen Armstrong. She's a historian of religion, and she has a very small but interesting book called "What Is a Myth?" And basically that book, she looks at the nature of myth and how myth has shaped human beings for thousands of years, and so myth is the same way of talking about narrative story. So yes, you have people like Joseph Campbell, who spent his entire career, teaching and writing about myth. Carl Jung spent his entire career studying, the myths of the world, and how they shape human personality and how they shape human conduct. All human beings are shaped by narrative. And if there's one, arena among human beings that has mastered this thing called narrative or myth, it's religion. Okay, and so we cannot exist. We are storytellers. We are shaped by the type of imagery that comes out of it. These narratives give us purpose. They help us understand our past, our present, and the future. We even when you attempt to replace religion with something else, i.e. secularism, you're going to do so by giving the world a kind of narrative. So the atheist, Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, he, in as much as he was a diehard critic of the Abrahamic traditions and just believed that they needed to die. He believed he had a narrative about progress. He had a narrative about enlightenment. He had a narrative, a story about what society, should look like without religion. You know what I mean? And he lived by that. So no, we cannot get around story. We can't get around narrative. In many respects, you're going to have religion in one form or another.
Yeah, and this is what I would say. Contemporary secularized religion has become major motion pictures, TV series, heroic stories in comic books, or their adoption to the screen. I mean, you see various philosophical issues being presented there, but the stories are the same. There's nothing new under the sun. There are really no new stories to be told, but there is new wisdom to be gleaned by those persons who are actually looking for it, right? So this is why we keep coming back to the book of Proverbs and its main theme, which deals with the subject matter of wisdom, because there's multifaceted ways in which wisdom can be presented. And it is not just in the form of secularized ideology or philosophy. It's not just in the form of doctrine where you have to follow a certain set of rules or procedures. And it's not just stories, but it's an amalgam of different things. But you have to have the wisdom to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff, to be able to know what the essence of the message is to begin with. And I think that ultimately, even in the tradition of Christianity, you see a break with zealotry. You see a break away from, this kind of hard doctrine that doesn't allow for any kind of malleability. It's, this idea that you have to follow the law to the letter, or else, you will be in violation of God's will. And then that's, I'm thinking about the verse that's brought forth where Christ says, the law was made for man, not man for the law. You get what I'm saying? So the idea here is we can have all the rules and the laws in the world. We can have all the ideals in the world, but they're instruments, they're tools to help us become more wise so that we can live better lives and live more just and more righteous kind of lives, more virtuous lives. So,
and let me say this in relationship to that. So in this space, man, in this space that we're in, men talking about, men's lives, black men in particular. I mean, we are this is a place that, attracts thinking men, that attracts contemplation, that attracts people who are doing some type of introspection. Okay. And religion, these traditions that we're talking about, they all have traditions of introspection and contemplation. Okay. Christianity has its own tradition of contemplation and introspection. Whether you're talking about Catholicism or Protestantism, it's there in Buddhism. You have that, in ancient India, you had your seekers, you had your wanderers, you had your esoteric teachers, who were always critical of the dominant strands of tradition. So basically, you have an intellectual apparatus that's built in most of these traditions that function to serve as a check and balance to zealotry. Okay, so like with Islam, you have the Sufis, you have the mystics, and when you think about the Sufis in Islam, the Sufis, they serve as a check and balance to the radical Muslim, the zealots, the ones who have gone overboard with extremism, or the fundamentalism, the fundamentalists. So and you find the same type of people within. You have Jewish mystics, you have Christian mystics, and within those traditions, yes, they serve to check people who have gone off the hinges, who have gone too far. And so, we're in a space that is not far removed, from these sensibilities, man. When you talk about MGTOW, you talk about red pill, we talk about the different type of orientations that exist in the space. All of it has some connection to religion. When you talk about men going monk, when you talk about monk mode and the light, you're talking about something that's ancient. When men separate, when they withdraw from the world in order to think and to contemplate their lives and to think about where they've been and to think about where they're going, they're operating no different from Buddhist monks. They're operating no different from the Catholic priest. They're operating no differently from the mystics, from all the traditions. Okay, and so we are operating in that fashion. The book of Proverbs, you have this actually this narrative of men, of an older male who was talking to younger men. You have generations communicating, you people communicating cross-generationally, okay, passing down wisdom to one another. Okay, so we are in the domain. Everything that we're doing is in proximity to what the world religions have done for thousands upon thousands of years.
right. And Sandal, come here and bring your insights here, because it seemed like you were going to chime in at a point, and then you kind of like just,
no, man. I like the points that the doctor's making, and what I want to add on to what he was talking about in terms of human beings and narratives, right? And one of the things that we have to do within our community is that, when you talk about like Christianity was used for, it's the white man's religion, or Islam is the white man's religion, or whatever the case be, what he talked about, human beings living in narratives, right? And if you read the Bible itself, and the doctor can correct me if I'm wrong, but the only European nation mentioned in the Bible is Rome, right? Everything else pretty much happened between Africa and up to Iran, or maybe Central Asia, right? So when you look in the book of Genesis, Nimrod the Cushite, Cush being an ancient word for Ethiopia, right? The land of Cush, right? Which encompasses Ethiopia and up to a point Yemen, right? And so because they would take each other over back and forth in the old days, right? The Cushitic Empire. And Nimrod would go on to establish Middle Eastern civilizations in accordance to the Bible. So I believe people like the Akkadians, the Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians could be somehow connected to Nimrod's influence in the Bible, right? When you look at the book of Revelation and it gives you the description of Jesus talking about how his feet look like burnt brass, and right, and using wool in the depiction, and using wool in the depiction of his hair, or how when Moses put his hand in the cloak, took it out and it was white and leprous, and then had it put back in and having it restored to its color, right? Zipporah, Moses' wife, was Ethiopian. In Islam, we have hadith that says that Moses was black, right? And some people even say up to the point of being crow black, right? The same thing. There are competing hadiths, but there are hadiths about Jesus being a very handsome, a very handsome dark man. So at the end of the day, philosophy can be these stories, these philosophies. Like you said, you can take these things and you can paint narratives onto them, right? And so if you don't know, if your perspective is only the world that you know as you live in it, because there was a time when you take the Romans, for example. I was talking to one of my friends and we were having a comic book debate, right? He's a South African guy from Greece. And he was, he had his beef about certain characters, taking certain white characters and making them black. And I said, you have a heart attack over fiction when they actually do this with your own history, right? I said, when I told him, I said, you're Greek, correct? He said, yes. I said, what did your ancestors think of the people of Northern Europe, of their northern neighbors? What did they think of the Germans, the Gauls, and the British? They thought that they were animals, correct? But how come now, whenever I watch any damn movie about the Roman Empire, somehow the actors have British accents?
Yeah, well, that,
right?
Yeah, that all comes through Eurocentrism, though. Go ahead.
Correct, and that's what I'm saying. And I said, so what happened? Those Celtic people took your history in order to produce the narrative that they were at the forefront of civilization. When you go back in time, they were nothing more than merchants, and simple people. And then I asked them, what did the Roman Greeks, what did the Roman Greco powers think about Ethiopians, right? They said that the Ethiopians were the most pious of all men, to the point where they even believed that Mount Olympus was in Ethiopia. Right? The same thing with Muhammad, peace be upon him. When the Muslims faced severe persecution and they were near being destroyed, they sent them to Ethiopia for protection. The Negus of Abyssinia protected them. Right? He protected them. And basically, the pagan Arabs came there, wanted to catch these people. And then ultimately, the pagan Arabs was like, we believe in Jesus. He was a prophet. And then the Negus will go on to say, hey, our religions are like two beams of light coming from the same source, right? I cannot hand these men over to you. And even in early Christian history, and the doctor can correct me if I'm wrong, right? The original Pope was in Egypt. So when you, like I said, one of the things about it is that I don't want us to get caught up in the fact that, again, that the prophets were these weak men, and that at the end of the day, like, these are all fluffy, Eurocentric stories. You have to remove yourself from these narratives. This is ancient knowledge. And when you actually dig deeper into that ancient knowledge, you will see that the ancient world perceived us differently than how we're seen now.
Yeah, so Ronald, like, just to draw from your wisdom, I mean, because you study in this area a lot more than I do, although there is some sort of cross-collateralization there, because I study the ancient Greeks and I study their philosophy. So I study pre-Socratic philosophy. So an Examiner and Exemenes, Anaxagoras, and then I studied Thales, of course, and then moved from Parmenides, Heraclitus, and all these guys. Then we start off with Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Then we make a jump to, a lot of times we bypass the Roman philosophers, but they're all, Epictetus, and, the Stoics that come from the Roman Empire. And then even St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and then you go to Descartes, and then you get modernity, and then now you have what's contemporarily perceived as this narrative of the train, the genealogy of Western thought. But we often bypass the Islamic world and how they preserve Aristotelianism, and that it would have been lost without the people from the Arabic world preserving it and philosophizing about it. So one of the things that I don't want to get caught here, but I want to talk about it and discuss it. Why is it that Black people don't see themselves as the inheritors of a grand religious and philosophical tradition, man? What is this?
Well, I think Protestant Christianity is responsible for that, in the way in which it was communicated to us, and how we through slavery, and we create our own traditions in the United States. I think that Black people are not that different from white people, white Protestants in particular, because we have a unique brand of Christianity that's unique to the United States. And Black people have the same problem that white people have, is that we're provincial when it comes down to our religious traditions, meaning that we can only see what we have, what's in front of us. And our institutions, churches, leadership, education contributes to that. It's like if you travel outside the United States, and you go to other countries, people from other countries have a very different view of America than we have of ourselves. They see us as pompous, they see us as arrogant, and there's a lot of contempt for Americans, largely because we travel oftentimes, and largely because we have a gross ignorance of the world, and unfortunately, the problem that you're talking about, it's not just a Black problem, it's an American thing. And what we have to do, and I tell you this, what we have to do is push Black people to be more expansive. The Nation of Islam, interestingly, it was one organization, tradition, that tried to push Black people in a different direction. Okay, so when Elijah Muhammad embraces Islam through Fard, and he embraces what was once called Orientalism. He really, took a paradigm that connected Black people, to the ancient Near East and to the Middle East and to what we would call, Islamic civilization, something that would take them, way beyond the American experience. But only a portion of Black people took hold of that. Malcolm X, here's the thing. When you look at someone like Malcolm X, and you look at Malcolm X's genius, and you look at him being an intellectual, and you look at his embrace of Islam, and you look at the ways in which he transformed himself over and over again over the course of a lifetime until he was assassinated, what you get is a Black person who has opened himself, okay, to the world. Okay, he was very effective in terms of his own, advocacy and everything, because he really severed ties with those provincial aspects of the American experience through his embrace of Islam, okay, and his embrace of the Islamic that whole Islamic enlightenment tradition with philosopher Averroes and what you mentioned with the that fusion between Aristotelianism and Islamic traditions, and that gave him a different sensibility. It gave Black Muslims in the Nation of Islam a different sensibility. It gave when Black people became Orthodox Muslims, it gave them a different type of orientation towards the world. That has not happened with um, with Black Christians, with Black people who most of whom have a Christian background, most of whom are committed to Christianity. So that's the big thing. Islam. We think about Islam. We don't think about the United States. We think about a completely different part of the world. So it forces you to think internationally. It forces you to think in a very, very expansive way. Um, and I wish Black people and particularly Black men would take that type of route that some of our Muslim brothers and sisters have taken in terms of thinking differently about knowledge and enlightenment and all of that, because it would definitely take us into a different direction.
Yeah. And another thing I want to discuss, like when you discuss Proverbs, because a lot of times what we do is we like to discard the message because we don't like package, the packaging of the message, right? But one of the things that's very important that I have drawn from the book of Proverbs is this idea that correction is valuable. Like listening to the criticism of others is is incomparable in relation to its value. That the person who's able to absorb criticism without being offended and being aroused to anger is somehow in a beneficial position above and beyond that of the average person. So I want to kind of speak to this because nobody wants to be told that they're wrong, especially Americans. And I don't want to get into sexist here right now because I want to keep this a dignified conversation. I mean, we can, but the whole point is people generally don't like to be told that they're wrong or that their opinion is bad or that their attitude or the behavior or comportment is awry. So let's talk about that. Let's shift the conversation to that, and then if we can, we'll spend another 30 minutes talking about it. But then we'll get out of here. But why don't people like correction anymore? Why is it so anathema for people to be told that's wrong what you're doing? I don't like your attitude. I don't like the way you're behaving and comporting yourself. Why can't we do that anymore? And think you're unreasonable, man.
Yeah, I attribute it to the impact of psychology, of therapy, psychiatry, and to many degrees, the therapeutic culture that has been so popular, over the last, decades. You know what I mean? I mean, when you think about it, I mean, we have a culture of therapy, that affirms people where they are. It doesn't critique people. You think about Oprah Winfrey, man. When she was on television, and she was a major voice for this type of therapeutic sensibility, and it's pervaded every institution. Where you can't criticize anyone. You can't be critical. You can't be quote unquote judgmental. You have to affirm people. You have to support their endeavors without any type of critical analysis, and it's gone overboard. It's in TV. It's in the churches. So the churches today are places where you don't hear any type of moral critique. You don't hear, any type of evaluation of people's lives and their conduct, morality. and what have you. And so it's infiltrated, just every institution, and that's a part of it. It's the psychological, it's the entire psychological turn that took place after the 1970s and everything, and we still have not gotten over it, so that's how I see it, and yeah, and that's what makes, what you're talking about, and what, revisiting some of these narratives, going back to the wisdom tradition, Jewish wisdom tradition. That's what makes it this very difficult for some contemporary ears, because they don't want to, look at themselves in the mirror. They don't want that rod of correction. But as we see, our society is falling apart as a consequence of it. I mean, it is falling apart.
Yeah, I mean, so the way I see it, the ills of our age are the embracing of modern political philosophy, with this idea that you should be able to do whatever it is you want, as long as whatever it is that you do doesn't harm anybody else. So you have freedom from other people, you have freedom from the government, and as long as those things are maintained, whatever else it is that you do is perfectly fine, right? But that assumption, to me, is false, because the way that I look at the social contract tradition as a counterfactual claim made by white men in Europe in order to throw off what they consider to be the excesses of ecclesiastical authority and the divine right of kings. And so that's where the whole language of rights comes from. That's where this whole language of negative liberty and life, liberty, and property comes from. I mean, these are fictions that we take as truth, and we don't go. You should be looking at the history out of which these concepts sprang forth, but we don't do that intellectual work. We just start with the understanding that these things are true, and I don't see how we can move forward. But everybody, there are critiques in this culture, but they're of a certain kind, and they're presented as being absolutely true to such an extent that there's no room for any alternatives. Okay, so but getting back to it though, but not getting so esoteric and so abstract about it. I always like to say this, man. If people point their fingers at people, but when you point the finger, it's three pointed back at you. And there's this idea that don't judge lest you be judged. The pot calling the kettle black, however you want to call it. But the reality is that the wise person is going to listen to criticism, because they're going to use the criticism as a means to correct themselves, because apparently you can't see yourself in the way that other people can see you. And sometimes you can't assess yourself objectively where others can. So there's a verse in Proverbs 9:8. Don't reprove a scoffer, or he will hate you. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you. So the idea here is there are some people who don't want to be told that they're wrong at all. They don't have any interest in believing that they're wrong at all. But there are some people who are wise, and the wise will be accepting of criticism and critique because they know that it will help them in the long run.
Let me add another layer here. The overarching problem that you put your hand on is the aversion that we have towards authority. So the anti-authoritarianism, there's an anti-authoritarianism that came out of the 1960s that impacted the entire society. And religiously, the anti-authoritarian was a protest against parental authority. It was a protest against the father. So when you talk about Proverbs, you're talking about the language of a father figure. When you're talking about these wisdom traditions, you're talking about the insights, the wisdom of what we conceive as men. All right. When you talk about Socrates, when we imagine Socrates, we imagine Jesus, when we imagine Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. All right. These wisdom traditions are traditions that are associated with men. And authority is associated with these men. So when you talk about correction, you talk about evaluation and the like, what does that do? That reminds us of the parent. The parent. And we have a problem with that. We have a problem with the parent, and particularly the image of the father. And so the conversations that we have, about women, the conversations that we have about where this society is going, has a lot to do with the nature of authority, and the way in which we live in a moment in a society where huge segments of the population are just anti-authority, okay, and do not want to be evaluated. But here's the thing: you can't live. We know that in the real world, authorities exist. And in the real world, there are checks and balances. We do have prisons. We do have a criminal justice system. We do have the police. We do have judges. We do have something to put our robust or expansive or extreme sense of freedom in check. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so, we're getting ready to see it expand in a real way after this election. Okay. And so, yeah, I think that's what this conversation about wisdom and about correction and what have you, man. All this stuff has to do with authority and discipline. All those things that a lot of people hate, man. They don't want this stuff.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, I used to tell, so, I've been in many relationships throughout my life, some with single mothers, some with no mothers, and I made single baby mothers, whatever the case may be. But, I used to always tell the kids that I had under my purview, man, that discipline is everything. And because without discipline, you can't do anything. I mean, think about the person who's going to become a carpenter. He has to have discipline in order to learn the trades from a master who knows. And so he has to be corrected in order to learn the virtues associated with being a carpenter.
Yeah.
The same with somebody who's playing an instrument. They have to be corrected and amenable to critique in order to be able to play the instrument correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Or the person could be a cook, right? Or learning how to be a chef, and the master chef is telling them, no, you're doing it wrong. You're cutting the vegetables wrong. Or you are, you're using the spices in the wrong way. You have to be open to listening, especially if you're somebody who's an apprentice and you're taking instruction from somebody who's a master, right? But in this culture, it's a free for all. Like, okay, so I tell people, look, there's 4 common approaches to morality, and it is what it is. You can take it or leave it. Now, the first approach has 3 subparts to it. You got moral subjectivism, moral nihilism, and moral skepticism. Okay. Then you got ethical relativism, and you have what's called soft universalism or hard universalism. Now, I'm not going into the details of all of it.
Yeah.
It seems like at the current moment, we're caught up in a situation that is unique to modernity, or what comes thereafter.
Yeah.
Not only moral skepticism, if there is a moral code, we don't know what it is. Subjectivism, what's right or wrong is just based on the inner state of myself and God as to what's right or wrong. And then you get more nihilism, which ultimately is the idea that there is no right or wrong, and you can do whatever the hell you want to do, right? So the more often, more often than not, I find that people are more skeptics, subjectivists, or more nihilists, and there's no way to solve moral problems if you adopt those viewpoints. So I mean, because if there is no morality, then how can someone tell you you're wrong? If you have no know that there's a right or wrong, how can you tell somebody they're wrong? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And if there's moral subjectivism and it's just what you feel, then what's right or wrong? It's just what you feel. So, but then again, as you say, objectively, in the real world, there's a set of facts that'll smack you in the face. And unfortunately, it's smacking black men in the face more than anybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, there's so many cultural realities that exist in black society that, you know, ill-equip black men to ground themselves in, you know, a type of, you know, moral tradition. Unfortunately, you know, it's one of the gripes that I have with the black church, you know, and that black church has really failed, you know, big time, by not addressing the situation with black men, by focusing primarily on women and children. You know, you just let black men, you know, try to figure this thing out all by themselves. You know what I mean? In a society, you know, that is, you know, predatory and is not really interested in their development. You know, and you know, I mean, you know, when you remove, you know, fathers from the home, when you remove discipline, when you remove that type of male purpose, you know, you have you know, men who become their rudderless ships, you know. And I mean, we know all of this. And so again, to bring things back here to this conversation, and people who are listening, it's a wonderful thing for the younger men who are listening, because we're doing something that has been missing. I mean, we're doing something that hasn't been done, you know, in you know, in decades, maybe 3 or 4 generations, you know. So, you know, in Jim Crow, you know, and even prior to Jim Crow, I mean, you had a different formation. You had a different situation where you had intergenerational communication, when you had men who were who were the apprentice of other men. You know, we had young men who were learning from older men, who were talking to older men, you know, grandfathers, and on, passing wisdom down. And all of that stuff at the end of the day contribute to what you became as a man, you know. But you know, that changed, and here we are, you know, in this situation. And you know, and this right here, man, this is an intervention that's necessary, because, you know, the dominant secular milieu that we're in, it takes you nowhere, bro. It takes you nowhere. And a lot of people see it. A lot of people know it. It takes you absolutely nowhere.
Brother Sam, you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, you know, again, you know, Doc, for me in my Christian days, I come from Brooklyn, and I was a product of a man called Dr. Johnny Ray Youngblood.
I know him.
Yeah, yeah. And so, you know, where I grew up at, the church there was very male centered. That was his thing, to ensure that men came to church. And he would come out, you know what I'm saying, walk through the projects, you know, him and the guys that, you know, him and the men that he had, and then, you know, he would literally, you know, take guys off the street, to your point, and, you know, borrowing from models like Fruit of Islam, FOI, and everything else. You know, as a kid, I was a benefit. You know, I had my own dad. I had my dad, but I benefited from the programs that we had. So we had a program at a time called Sons of David, where, you know, it was black men of multi-generations, you know, exchanging knowledge, exchanging ideas, and everything else. And then later on, they developed a program called the Ma'afa. And the Ma'afa is when it's done every year, and it's still being done now, where they recognize, you know, they recognize our journey from chattel slavery to where we are now. And so there's a lot of seminars about slavery, you know, racism, you know, and then ceremonially, I think it ends with people going out to the water and people going out to the water to commemorate those that are coming. So I think, along with what I experienced as a kid and a few others, I think what needs to happen is that you have, with us, you have things that operate in these kind of single cells, and the idea, or what the idea should be, is to kind of take certain ideas in a sense and make them national, right? So, to make them national. And for me, like, what I would like to bring up is, because, I was listening to you guys talk, because, I'm learning, right? And if you were to read Pat Buchanan's book, The Depth of the Superpower, he was talking about how the civil rights movement actually broke the moral bond of America. And the reason why this perspective is wrong, but the reason why it broke the moral bond of America was, in order to subvert the rights of Black people or Black men, what did they do? They said, okay, we're going to back feminism. And so with feminism came all of these other left-wing ideologies that were used to take attention away from our struggle for freedom and for our movement. And what it was, from my perspective and my understanding of history, this was something that ultimately spun out of control. It spun out of control to the point where in American society, you can't correct anything. So if you want to correct something, and either it's not your business or you're a bigot. And for me, from my understanding of American history, I think that's where the bond was broken. Because if you look at a lot of the Black men, from Ayub Suleiman, who was a Muslim slave, all Martin Luther King and others, they engaged the United States within the framework of the Constitution, and also backed by the Word of God. Many of these men were preachers, men of God, or religious men themselves. And America, having a hardened heart, told these men, hey, bye-bye, right? And even killed some of them. So the way the people of old would kill the prophets that were sent to them, right? Because they didn't like what was being said to them. Now, when you take all of that and you go into the Proverbs of what do they say? Do not plan. Proverbs 3:29 says, do not plan evil against your neighbor who dwells trustingly beside you. And then it goes on to say, surely you're not amongst the believers unless what you want for your brother is what you want for yourself. And so if you look at African Americans being a cultural and moral foundation of this country on a spiritual level, since there were powers that wanted ruin for us, the trade-off spiritually is ruin ultimately for that society. So you had a crack epidemic, there was a heroin epidemic. We lost jobs, they lost jobs, right? And so it's that heart and heart, that hatred, and that complete lack of understanding, and that complete lack of spiritual understanding, to understand that not only do we live, not only do we live together, physically, but there are also rewards or consequences in terms of how we deal with each other, right? And so now collectively within our society, you're at the point where you cannot, like I said, where you cannot confront evil, because as it says, right, we don't deal in flesh and blood, but in principalities. And so when you look at like current movements now that may feel that they're civil rights movement, and this is where you have chaos, right? Because at the end of the day, this is why you're headed for chaos. And I told one of my white friends this. I said, everything you're seeing is not something to judge. Ultimately, it is a consequence, right? Because remember, principalities, princes, lawmaking bodies, like I said, entities. So if these things are dedicated, are dedicated towards wickedness, as many of us having Southern roots, as my mother used to say, hey son, if you dig one grave, dig two, because the other one is there for you.
Yeah, and I would say this. So look at China, man. Look what China's doing in the world right now, and look at how China has beefed itself up in terms of its economy, in terms of its technology, etc. China is in Africa. You know, China is has, you know, the United States, you know, in a corner. And, you know, we have this perception of China as being this anti-democratic, you know, communist type of entity. But when you look at what China has become over the past several decades, you can't help but notice the extent to which they've maintained some sense of authority. People call it authoritarianism. The Chinese suspended human rights, Western understandings of human rights, not all human rights, but they suspended the kind of liberalism that the United States is known for in an effort to build itself up, okay, to have a code, okay. And so you have aspects of feminism there and liberalism there, but it has not overwhelmed the entire Chinese population, okay, which puts them in a position to be the next thing on planet Earth. All right. And in America, at the same time that China is dominating, America is falling, America is declining, America is crumbling from within. And a large reason why it is crumbling from within is because America has no center. It has no center. It has no unifying or common core in terms of how you understand law, order, etc. And I don't want to be, heard, in the wrong fashion. I'm not someone who says that, authoritarianism needs to be implemented here in the United States. But what I am saying is that there is a reason why you have an entity like China, which is rising, which is going to continue to expand. And while at the same time the United States continues to decline. So what's going to happen inevitably, if it doesn't happen within our lifetime, it's going to happen at some point. Some government, some generation is going to have to say stop. We got to go back. We got to read the books. We have to reread this history that we're talking about, and rethink this entire project. And that's, I think that's where we are. So this thing with black men, and we're talking about again with the canary in the coal mine. We are the microcosm of what is happening. Not only in the larger society, man, but even beyond.
Yeah, let me just say this, right? So the funny thing about it is that we both taught at the collegiate level, Doc, and saying, dog, you've governed men by means of the military, right? So, and we've all been through college, right? And one of the things that college is supposed to teach you, it doesn't matter if you got a Bachelor of Science or a Bachelor of Arts degree, right? You're supposed to get some sort of education in relation to the humanities, meaning that you're supposed to learn history, sociology, all depending on what university you attend, theology, philosophy. This way you get to understand that other people thought. You learn the axiology along a whole bunch of dimensions so that you can understand how it contributed towards the way that you think now. But right now, we don't think that the ancients have anything to teach us because we think we know it all right now. And it's all based upon hedonism, subjectivism, and opportunism. I mean, financial gain. But all of the faith traditions tell us hedonism by itself, just rote hedonism, if it's not tempered, leads to destruction. That the accumulation of money makes you miserable if there's no value system to check it. Because the fool and his money will soon part, and just having a love of money above that of human beings leaves you miserly, right? Literally makes you miserable. Okay. But there's something to learn from these ancient traditions, whether they be philosophical, whether they be religious, or whether they be, uh, well, I think that's all we really actually have, philosophy and theology. So if we don't think that we can learn anything from these because we know it all now, that just shows you how bankrupt our understanding is. Because again, there's nothing new under the sun. We don't know it all. And there are men who've gone through these steps and have taken these paths before, and they have a great, kind of architect kind of structure that we would be well off by paying attention to, man. That's all I got to say about it. So I don't want to run people in the ground. So I'm gonna just try to make some closing remarks, and then we're gonna get up on out of here. So brother Neal, would you like to say anything before we close out?
Yeah, man, I would just say that just to add to what you're saying, man, the other thing that hedonism does is it diminishes human relationships, and it reduces us, to our senses, and it alienates us from other human beings. So the other part of what you're saying about the humanities and the like, the function of philosophy, the function of religion, when we study it in history, and the other aspects of the humanities, is to make us better human beings, is to make us appreciate the human abode, to have better relationships with other human beings. So there's the ethical component, man, and to have fellowship, to appreciate the beauty, of humanity. So I think that's the other part of it. But I just want, I just want the brothers who are listening here to don't take lightly the resources of religion as you think about your lives and you think about the future. There are a lot of guys who come to these spaces, who come from backgrounds where, they were forced to fend for themselves, man. They were forced to figure this thing out, man, and, trial and error. And I tell you, man, look to these traditions and learn as much as you can. Don't allow, the kind of hedonistic, society that we live in to be the end all be all for you. The television and commercials, capitalist society, as we experience it, at the end of the day, it's going to leave you empty.
Brother Sam, you got some knowledge to get to us before we close out here, brother.
Yeah, man. I want to thank you and the Dr. GP, because the point that I want, the closing remark that I want to make is, in today's world, you have the opportunity to be multifaceted, right? You could be many things at once. And with that being said, the point that I want to get to let the audience know, is how important men like Green Gorilla and the Doctor are. Because now in our society, you are hearing a lot of trash rhetoric to say that things like psychology degrees, philosophy degrees, theologian degrees, and history degrees are worthless. And that is a lie. Because at the end of the day, right, you are in dangerous territory when you live in a world that says only things that generate profit are of value. So this society is looking at decay because you're telling people that there's no benefit in the preservation of knowledge, right? And so I would tell anybody, if you're going to be an electrical engineer or whatever it is that you're going to be, remember theology, philosophy, psychology, sociology, right? All of these things are still quintessential parts of the solutions to our problems, right? So in that regard, I would say don't follow the ways of dominant society with a thought in regards to these particular areas of study.
Yeah, and then my closing remark is, having been a student of philosophy, I think that the philosopher that drew me in to study the discipline was Plato. And although I don't agree with much of what he has to say now, I do agree with what he has to say about the soul, namely that you have three parts of your soul. But I mean, there are different people from different faith-based traditions that would carve the soul into even more parts than three. But I mean, I think that as a good starting point, you can use the idea that There's a physical aspect of yourself, there's an emotional aspect of yourself, and then there's a part of you that thinks. And that, you can't allow the part of you that feels and that is appetitive, or that, just deals with hedonism, is the part of you that needs to be satisfied the most. And that all you need to do is use your emotions and your rationality in service of your physical body. That's still going to leave you bankrupt. That's just not how you operate. What you need to do is you need to have a soul that's in balance, and you have to understand the proportion that you're supposed to give to pleasure. Pleasure's great. You're supposed to experience it, but too much of anything is not a good thing. So just understand that, brothers, and then also understand you are a thinking being, but you got to enjoy yourself as well. You can't just be you can't be a philosopher without being a man. So having said all that, have a good Friday, gentlemen, man. Enjoy yourselves and take care, man. We about to get up out of this thing. And thank you, brothers, Sandog and Dr. Neal, man, for hollering at me this good.
All right.
So
It's a
y'all,
pleasure.
man. Peace.
Peace. Peace.
I know you player haters gon' hate, cause I'm at the finish line and I'm in the first place. I'm a winner, and I know I'll never lose.